It's 6:47 in the morning and Jake is sitting on the edge of his bed staring at an email he's already read 4 times. Subject line, notice of lease renewal terms. His rent is going up 14%, not because he did anything wrong, not because the building got nicer, just because the market moved and his landlord can move with it. 4,000 miles away in a mid-sized German city, a woman named Lena is making coffee in the same one-bedroom apartment she's lived in for 5 years. Same rent as the day she signed. Give or take a few euros. Same continent, roughly the same lifestyle. Wildly different relationship with the number that shows up in their bank account every month. So what if I told you the gap between Jake's morning and Lena's morning doesn't come down to luck, or the city they picked, or even how much they earn? It comes down to a handful of laws neither of them wrote, sitting in a rental contract most people sign without reading past the highlighted line for the monthly rent. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what those laws are, what they'd actually save or cost you in dollars and euros, and where the popular idea that Europe is just cheaper completely falls apart. If you're new here, I'm Justin. I'm American. I've lived in Germany for over 12 years now, and I've rented apartments on both sides of the Atlantic. This channel is built on real numbers from real leases, not tourist brochure guesses. If that's useful to you, hit subscribe because we do this every week, one real cost, fully broken down, USA versus Germany. Here's the assumption almost everyone brings into this topic. Rent in Germany is cheap, rent in America is expensive, end of story. And I get why people think that. You'll see headlines about €600 apartments in Germany right next to $2,000 apartments in the US, and the math looks obvious. But that's comparing a one-bedroom in Chemnitz to a one-bedroom in San Francisco. The real answer isn't cheaper or more expensive, it's that the two systems are built on completely different rules, and those rules matter more than the sticker price. Now, to be fair to the American side of this, US wages are, on average, meaningfully higher than German wages, especially in tech, finance, and corporate roles. A raw price comparison without adjusting for income can be misleading. American apartments are also, on average, newer, bigger, and more likely to come with a dishwasher, air conditioning, and a walk-in closet without you having to install any of it yourself. That's a real trade-off, and I don't want to pretend it isn't. But price and square footage are only part of this story. The bigger difference is what happens after you sign the lease, and that's where it gets interesting. Let's start with the base numbers. As of 2026, the average rent across the US sits around $1,900 to $2,000 a month, though that swings hard by city, under $1,500 in a lot of the Midwest, north of $3,000 in San Francisco or New York. In Germany, rent is quoted as Kaltmiete, cold rent, meaning just the base rent for the space itself. A one-bedroom outside the biggest cities can run somewhere in the €400 to €800 range. In Munich or Frankfurt, that same one-bedroom jumps to €1,500 to €2,000 or more. Munich, frankly, is not the cheap Europe fantasy people imagine. On top of the cold rent, you add any bin costs like heating, water, trash, and maintenance. Budget roughly €250 to €300 a month for those, depending on the size of the place. Add that to the cold rent and you get what's called Warmmiete, the warm rent, usually 20 to 30% higher than the number you first saw listed. If you're apartment hunting in Germany and only budget for the cold rent, you're going to be short every single month. This is where the systems really start to diverge, what it costs you just to get the keys. In the US, a typical move-in stacks a security deposit, usually 1 to 1.5 months rent on top of first month and sometimes last month's rent up front. In cities like New York or Boston, you can also get hit with a broker's fee, historically 10 to 15% of your annual rent, paid by the tenant, just for someone showing you apartments. On a $2,000 apartment, that's a move-in bill that can clear $6,000 or $7,000 before you've unpacked a single box. In Germany, the security deposit, the Kaution, is capped by law at 3 months cold rent. Not warm rent, cold rent. And it's a hard cap. A landlord asking for more is legally not allowed to enforce it. On top of that, since 2015, there's something called the Besichtheiterprinzip. Whoever hires the broker pays the broker. In practice, that means if the landlord brought in an agent, the landlord pays the fee, not you. That single rule alone can save a renter in Germany thousands of dollars compared to a broker fee city in the States. Here's the part almost nobody talks about, and it might be the biggest difference of all: how long you're actually allowed to live somewhere. The standard US lease is 12 months. At the end of it, the landlord can choose not to renew you, raise the rent to whatever the market will bear, or in a lot of states, end the tenancy with fairly minimal justification. You're renewing your right to stay every single year. The standard German lease is unbefristet, unlimited, no end date at all. Once you're in, you're in. A landlord can't just decide not to renew you next year because there's no next year deadline to begin with. Terminating a German tenant requires specific legal grounds, like the landlord genuinely needing the apartment for personal use. And even then, tenants get months of notice, sometimes up to 9 months depending on how long they've lived there. And that stability extends to the rent itself. Germany has something called the Mietpreisbremse, the rent brake. In designated high-demand areas, rent on a new lease can't be set more than 10% above the local reference rent, which is tracked through something called the Mietspiegel. That rent cap was recently extended out to 2029. Existing tenants get even more protection. Annual rent increases are capped, typically to 20% over 3 years in most areas, less in the tightest markets. Jake's 14% jump in a single renewal cycle. In most of Germany, that would simply be illegal. Now here's the twist, because Germany is not a renter's paradise with no downsides. First, a lot of German apartments come completely unfurnished. Not no couch unfurnished, no kitchen, no cabinets, no stove, no sink installed. Tenants routinely buy an entire kitchen, out of pocket, sometimes paying the outgoing tenant a few €1,000 just to take theirs off their hands. Second, because tenants have so much protection once they're in, landlords are extremely selective about who gets in the first place. You'll typically need a Schufa credit report, proof of income around 3 times the rent, and in big cities you might be one of 50 applicants standing in a hallway for a single viewing. The security comes after you get the apartment. Getting it is its own competition. If you're actually looking into renting or buying here, navigating the Schufa process and the upfront paperwork is where most Americans get stuck first. I'll drop a link below to the service I'd actually recommend for getting that sorted before you start apartment hunting. So let's go back to Jake and Lena. Jake's rent didn't go up because his apartment changed. It went up because nothing in his contract said it couldn't. He's not being cheated, he's just operating inside a system built for flexibility, for both sides including the landlords. Lena's rent stayed flat not because her landlord is generous, but because the rent break and the annual increase caps made a 14% jump illegal in the first place. The cost of that stability was a rougher path in, a kitchen she had to buy herself, a credit report, and a stack of competing applicants the day she viewed the place. Neither one of them got the better deal in every category. They got different deals, built on different assumptions about what a rental contract is supposed to protect. So here's what I'd actually do with this, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on. 1. If you're renting in the US, read your renewal terms the day you sign the original lease, not the day the increase notice shows up. Know your state's rules on notice periods and rent increase caps because they vary wildly by state and even by city. 2. If you're moving to Germany, budget for warm rent, not cold rent, and set aside €2,000 to €4,000 beyond the deposit for a kitchen and move-in furnishings you may not expect to buy. 3. Get your credit report and income documents ready before you start viewings, not after you find a place you like. In competitive cities, the applicant with paperwork ready wins the apartment. 4. Whichever country you're in, ask directly whether a broker fee applies before you sign anything with an agent. In Germany, that fee is usually not yours to pay. In parts of the US, it absolutely might be. At the end of the day, the question was never really which country has cheaper rent. It's which system you're willing to trade into, flexibility and space in America or stability and paperwork in Germany. Jake will probably move again next year. Lena probably won't move for another decade. Neither of them is wrong. They just signed 2 very different kinds of contracts in 2 very different kinds of countries. If you want the next real number broken down like this one, subscribe and I'll see you in the next video.